Okay, we're live.
Wonderful. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by BCHR. Thank you all for joining us today about this important conversation on civil society and fundamental freedoms in Bahrain post-Arab Spring. We gather here today to mark the 11th anniversary of the 14th February 2011 pro-democracy protests in Bahrain, also known as the Day of Rage. The purpose of this event is to really reflect on the reforms that have or have not taken place in the past decade and the challenges that civil society faces going forward in their struggle for human rights. The way this panel will run really quickly is we'll start off with very broad general observations about the state of Bahrain's human rights situation before moving on to more targeted questions for today's event. And some issues that we want to touch on include first the BICI report, which is the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry's recommendations after Bahrain's Arab Spring. We'll talk about civil society as it stands today, Bahrain reform through national and multinational fora. In other words, how do we reform Bahrain from the outside? And lastly, we'll talk about prisoners of conscience and alternative sentencing. Before we get into all that, we have an excellent panel here today. And I want to take a few moments to introduce myself and all the wonderful speakers that joined us. My name is Anthony Hu. I'm a researcher with BCHR. It's a pleasure to be moderating this event. Our first guest is Joe Stork, who is the Deputy Director for Human Rights Watch's MENA division. Among other human rights issues, his current work focuses on the rights crisis in Bahrain. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 1996, he was the co-founder of the Middle East Research and Information Project and served as the chief editor of its flagship report, the Middle East Report. Then we have Jostein Koppelveld, who is the executive director of the RAFTO Foundation for Human Rights, which awards the annual RAFTO Prize to human rights defenders globally, including BCHR in 2013. Jostein has a long history of working with civil society members around the world, including at the Norwegian Church Aid. Next, we have Seema Watling, who is the Gulf researcher for Amnesty International. Seema is a longtime outspoken rights advocate for not only Bahrain, but throughout the Middle East. And last but not least, joining us today is Tor Holdenfield, who wears multiple hats at Civicus, including one at the UN Advocacy Advisor, where he helps coordinate Civicus's multilateral advocacy at the UN Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and also at the Universal Periodic Review, which is coming up this year, an important year for Bahrain. Thank you so much to all of you for taking time out of your busy days to be part of our discussion here today. So I guess we can just jump right in. I want to start off with very, general and broad observations about the human rights situation in Bahrain since 2011. We can talk about changes and continuities, and anybody can jump in. Does anybody want to start us off?
Okay, I'll try to start off. I started working on Bahrain right after I joined Human Rights Watch in 1996. And in some ways, if I look at the period in the late 90s, say 95 to 2000, when the new emir, now king, came in, that, of course, was a much rougher time, frankly, than it is today, even. Although in terms of civic space, I'd say it's very similar. I think one of the things that's changed, and the uprising in 2011 and the BICI report and so forth, were part of the process that, in many ways, I think, although we still report and monitor cases of torture and abuse by security forces in Bahrain, in my view, that situation is much improved. I mean, of course, it's terrible that it still goes on at all, but the extent of it, the institutionalization of it, and so forth, that's a pretty big change that we should recognize. And I think it's civil society in Bahrain, and the fact that, in fact, Bahraini activists at that time, as they are again today, in many cases operating abroad, outside of Bahrain. They're unable to be active inside Bahrain. But it's really been the attention that the BICI report in itself, in the aftermath of the uprisings, that the attention it gave to the torture issue, I think was extremely important and the recommendations that it made, some of which have actually been, well, among the few recommendations of BICI that have been implemented, have been those around sort of oversight within the Interior Ministry and so forth. I don't want to praise them because they're very inadequate in so many respects. And they're certainly not independent bodies as they're supposed to be. But I think we've seen a change in that. I think the other thing to note is, Bahrain, particularly in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, was a very dynamic place. I think, and in terms of civic space, it was probably, at least since the 70s, the most open period in terms of the ability of civil society to operate and make its voice heard. And it was that, that started to change in around 2008, 2009. We saw various crackdowns. We saw a resumption of a lot of torture in interrogation and coerced confessions and that sort of thing. But you also saw those people getting released, getting pardons and so forth. And it was that back and forth dynamic that sort of led up to the February 2011 demonstrations, mass demonstrations. I guess the other thing I'd note is that the closure of civic space, which is very saddening and very serious, it's not just a Bahrain. I mean, we're talking about the situation inside of Bahrain and with regard to Bahrain civil society, but it's a regional issue. You could say it's an international issue. I mean, one of the reasons that Bahrain is so closed, I think, is it has to do with with the neighborhood it's in, and particularly the role of Saudi Arabia. And in this regard, I think that casts a light on the international dimension because, of course, we continue to make representations in capitals like Washington about the situation in Bahrain and advocating X, Y, and Z. But the fact is, the reason there's very little resonance for those efforts, I think, has a lot to do with the neighborhood Bahrain is in, and the Saudi connection in particular, but not only. And so that you're really talking about a need to change really the regional situation and the international dynamic. The latest sort of illustration of that, a very unfortunate one, is now in Lebanon, in Beirut, where just last week I think it was the Interior Ministry, anyway, basically told a hotel that was planning to host an event of Bahraini opposition activists, they couldn't do so. A couple of months ago, I think it was in December, the Lebanese deported the Bahraini al-Wafaq activists who had held a press conference, held an event in a hotel, and at the behest of the Bahrainis in particular, but certainly it was, let's say, the GCC, to broaden it out, that led to that. So I think that's just to sketch out, that is what I think we're up against when we talk about civic space in Bahrain.
Thank you for that, Joe. You made a lot of important remarks that we want to go more specific in later today. So that's a wonderful way to start off. Does anybody else want to jump in here?
If I may, I'm Seema Watling, and I'm not a researcher on Bahrain. I'm the campaigner on Bahrain and other GCC countries. Joe, thank you very much for your intervention. I mean, yes, maybe the situation comparatively has slightly improved in Bahrain. However, I mean, there are still so many things that haven't taken place. I mean, on the surface, yes, there has been like implementation of some of the BICI recommendations, like the oversight bodies, but we know that they're not working and nothing's being done to improve them, like definitely from inside. Let's say the UK, who fund so much and work closely with Bahrain, still believe that it is fine, that these institutions are working and that the job is done. So that's still not acceptable. I mean, yes, there have been some legal reforms, the penal code that was amended, following BICI. We've had a code of conduct for the police officers, and prison law to regulate treatment of prisoners, etc. But in reality, that's not really the case. Maybe it's to a lesser degree than it was at the beginning after the uprising. We had it went up back in 2016. It went worse again, and now it seems to be stabilized to get back into kind of a stability at the moment. But still, you still get reports of severe violations. So no, I mean, it has improved relatively, but it's not enough. It is not enough. The authorities continue to, the discourse they have is not is not what is really happening on the terrain for people. The problem is also the fact that the civic space has been completely closed, in the sense that no opposition or nobody can say anything, without repercussions. I mean, yes, they have touted and introduced the alternative sentencing for prisoners, where they say, oh, we release people. Who has been released out of the big figures that we have been following since 2011? One, maybe two. But it's under extreme harsh conditions, where there are travel bans imposed. They cannot speak out. So their freedoms are extremely restricted. So, yeah, it exists. They have improved. They have introduced this law in 2017, but I cannot see how this improves their lives, apart from being free from prison. But they are free. They are prisoners in another manner. So yes, I'm a bit a bit more cautious as to say it has really opened up. It hasn't.
Yes. Maybe I could be a little bit clearer then. I was speaking specifically about the issue of torture. So I was not talking about the overall improvement, not at all. In fact, in terms of civic space, which is the main topic today, it's quite bad. It's quite bad. In some ways, it's as bad as it was, in between 75 and 2000, roughly speaking. So I was being very specific about one issue and highlighting the fact that the change that did occur there was the result of civic activity, civil societies activity, and specifically the BICI report, the focus of the BICI report on that issue. I mean, the BICI report was also very clear. Well, perhaps it could have been clearer about the need to release the high-profile detainees, the leaders of the protests, but it did call for their release. That's something we rely on in our continuing campaigns on their behalf. So again, please don't misunderstand me. I was talking about a very specific issue that I had worked on myself in that period. But overall, and in terms of civic space, we're back to kind of ground zero, so to speak.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you for those powerful comments, Seema, and apologies for the hiccup in your title. I think Tor wanted to jump in here.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and many thanks to BCHR again for hosting this important discussion on a somber but important day in the history of dissent in Bahrain. I just wanted to briefly follow up on Joe's remark about the situation in Bahrain, not it being unique in its context, but not in its global scope. At Civicus, where I work as a UN advisor and VUCA coalition coordinator, we had developed a platform called the Civicus Monitor, where we track civic space restrictions in real time, and we assess the environment for civil society in each country in the world. And Bahrain is part of a growing group of what we call closed countries. Countries where civil society, including protest movements, defenders, journalists, media, and organizations, do not have the space to operate independently or freely without persecution. So our data shows that only 3.1% of the world's population currently lives in what we call open countries, spaces where people have the space to express their diverging opinions, to criticize the government, and speak openly. The rest of the 96.9% of the world's population live in countries where governments actively seek to persecute people who exercise their legitimate and fundamental rights. And Bahrain is part of this inglorious group of countries where civil society is not able to exercise their fundamental and democratic rights. But I want to say one other thing. Despite the severe challenges that Bahraini civil society is subjected to, I think they're a model of ingenuity and fortitude, in the sense that civil society in Bahrain and outside have been able to mitigate these restrictions by developing a whole host of strategies and practices to continue to engage with the international community, inform the intergovernmental community about what's happening in Bahrain. They do exceptional research and exceptional advocacy despite all of the hostility that they experience. And it's, as I said, it is unfortunately atypical. Bahraini civil society is exceptional in their ability to overcome these restrictions. I think in our work, we see several other countries in civil society that are not as able, for a number of reasons, to continue their work at such a high level. And we've seen that the likes of BCHR and several others continue to hold the torch and keep the momentum going of the Day of Rage and the civil society movement that existed before 2011. And while the landscape is very different, civil society inside and outside Bahrain have done an exceptional job of keeping Bahrain on the international radar. And I just wanted to flag the exceptional work that continues to be done. And thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Tor. It's really interesting what you were saying about Bahrain civil society's ability to overcome, these repressive laws, and that's something that I definitely want to touch on later on. So that's an excellent point. I think Jostein was ready to speak.
Yes, thank you, and many thanks for the invitation to join you today, and on a very special day, and marking 11 years since the Arab Spring in Bahrain. This year is also 9 years since we awarded the Rafto Prize to Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and it was awarded for their courageous and long fight for fundamental rights such as freedom of speech and freedom of association in Bahrain. And 9 years on since that award, 11 years since the Arab Spring in Bahrain, I think also I just would like to follow on what others have said here, that first and foremost, I'm very impressed by how activists, how civil society in Bahrain have been able to hold on, to continue to stand up, and also for some of the improvements they were able to get through, but also, as Tor says, for keeping the attention on Bahrain. And then looking back now, it's also 11 years since the Arab Spring, 9 years since we gave the award. It's also very sad to say also that for many of them, the situation is quite critical, and the situation for the civic space in Bahrain is still very critical. And we see how both civil society, human rights defenders are being cracked down on, both in some of the traditional ways we know, with policing and torture and imprisonment, but also through we've seen the NSO revelations of how communication is being transmitted and being surveilled to an extent. Even if we knew it was there, it's even to an extent deeper and more extensive than what many believed. It is also very sad that many of the defenders are still imprisoned, like one of our laureates, Abdul Hadi Al-Kawaya, and other prominent defenders. And that we see, and I think that's a very clear case in Bahrain, many have to do this work outside Bahrain, in exile, and continues to do so. And when we awarded the Rafter Prize in 2013, one of the titles we had was that of the award statement was the fight for the inconvenient human rights in the Gulf. And I think that's still the case, that unfortunately it is inconvenient, not only for Bahraini authorities or in the region, but also for many governments in the EU and US and the UK who where Bahrain is an important also partner, and that makes those countries also weaker in their criticism of the human rights violations we see. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jostein. I think all of our panelists have made some really, really important remarks that really tied together. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation between everyone. And just to start off, talking more specifically about the human rights situation, I want to start off with Joe. Can you talk to us a little about how successful has the BICI report been since it was, recommended? I think Seema had talked about, a lot of these changes have been surface level, and it seems like you would agree. But could you get us started off there?
Well, let's face it, the BICI report, it got a lot of attention when it came out, and in November 2011, and I'd say for the following year, 2 years perhaps. There was a lot of attention to it. There were people, BCHR and many other groups inside and outside Bahrain were doing sort of scorecards of, what had been done, what hadn't been done. And of course, as the years went on, the list of what hadn't been done wasn't changing. The list of what had been done wasn't changing either. So the reforms that were made, inadequate as they were, the reforms that were made in the first year or so, and basically it's been at a standstill since then. I think the fact that there was a BICI investigation was a testament to the strength of the demonstrations of civil society in Bahrain, the manifestations of 2011 and before 2011 too, and continuing after 2011, of course, at a somewhat declining pace. I think as not surprisingly, I suppose, as the years went on and as there was no change, and as the regional environment continued to sort of seize up as states, not just Saudi Arabia, but the UAE in particular, kind of became much more authoritarian, much more openly authoritarian. The neighborhood, Bahrain's neighborhood, it deteriorated, frankly, in all the respects that we've been talking about in Bahrain. It was a neighborhood phenomenon, and the international parties, who, including the U.S., were extremely they just frankly stopped paying attention, and in Bahrain, the Bahrain crisis seemed to have been managed, and then of course the UK, I think, has played a particularly nefarious role in all of this, in its support, overt support for policing reforms and trainings and this sort of thing, which were, I mean, I'm sure you all can know it much more in detail than I do, but I don't think charade would be too strong a word to use in characterizing that. And so, the UK, of course, has been in my view, on the international stage, on the non-regional stage, the primary culprit. Can I use that word? The primary defender of Bahrain, the protector at the sort of international level. That's pretty tough to overcome, frankly. The fact that we're having this meeting outside of Bahrain is testifies to that, I think.
Absolutely. As you all may know, BCHR is one of the many NGOs who were forced to close down in Bahrain and not allowed to work legally in the country. But I think, looking back, BCHR also released a report. One of our wonderful researchers conducted one of the scorecards that you were talking about, assessing the BICI report's successes, where it missed, and stuff like that back in October. And I think it would agree with what you were saying. One thing that I want to follow up on is, you talked about one of the reforms that did take place was torture, and I was wondering, in the grand, can you talk a little bit more about how torture and the institutionalization of torture within Bahrain has changed in the last 11 years?
Well, back in when I started working on Bahrain in the mid-90s, to talk about the institutionalization of torture, I mean, it's hard to exaggerate how open it was and how thoroughly, routinely practiced it was. Frankly, I think my impression is, I haven't been able to travel to Bahrain since I think 2013. So I don't have perhaps the picture I'd like to have of what the actual situation is, but the open endorsement, the frankly open practice of torture that went on it didn't start in the mid-90s. It started in the mid 70s, frankly. But over that time, and with Brits in the command seat in the Ministry of Interior, it was routine. It was horrific. I don't think, my impression is it's not routine anymore. The kind of brutality you see and hear about, and that I'm aware of, is stuff that takes place at the point of arrest, which is kind of happens in a lot of places, frankly. What goes on inside. Now, the other side of this, of course, is that there haven't been protests on the scale of 2011, or for that matter, 2015 even. So were there to be the kind of mobilizations in the street that we saw back then, that's not to say we wouldn't see a resurgence of that sort of institutionalization or that routine use of torture to get coerced confessions and so forth, and just put a lot of people behind bars. So I think anyway, I want to use the word achievement, but I don't want to put a capital A on it. Okay, it's again, we should recognize what we achieved, what all of us helped to achieve, and the fact that even the Bahrainis, in contrast to the 75 to 2000 period, no longer feel enabled to carry out the kind of routine torture, horrible torture, really horrible torture, the kind that left marks. Okay, the fact that that's no longer the case is frankly, it's a positive thing. But the fact is, they've been able to shut down civil society. They've been able to shut down any modicum of independent media, with the exception of social media. But even there, the cyber laws and so forth have been used specifically to minimize the impact of social media. So that's we're in a terrible state right now, I think, frankly, in terms of civic space in Bahrain. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. That's a wonderful transition into talking about the state of civil society as it stands currently. And I know Jostein has a lot of experience working with civil society groups. Could you weigh in a little bit about how Bahraini civil society has performed in the past decade?
Well, I think it's a double, in the sense that, as we talked about, they have succeeded in getting attention on Bahrain. They have succeeded in many ways in mobilizing and challenging the government. But the price you pay is what happens to you then. So sometimes the crackdown you see is also a result of actually you have frightened some people in power, and that's also what we see in many places. But what I think, what listening also to what others are saying here, is you can see this tactic more of draining civil society of air, of resources, of financing, of ability to communicate. Kicking out NGOs, having legislation that makes it very difficult to operate, surveillance and cyber laws that makes it difficult to reach out, to communicate, to do work, difficult to get funding in, and all of these mechanisms we see so many places these days, that just makes civil society work very difficult, and in a way it's meant to just make it to drain all of those people who are trying to stand up for human rights. And of course, one of the terrible examples of that in Bahrain is the long prison sentences for some of the prominent defenders, and also treatment of defenders in prison, and also during now with the COVID pandemic, where they have lived in great risk, and this in many ways, human rights work is a marathon, and in Bahrain they are trying to make that a very, very long marathon, very, very challenging marathon for civil society, and it corresponds to what we see so many other places, unfortunately.
I think you said it really well when you put it as draining, Bahraini authorities draining civil society. Is that I didn't think of it that way, and it makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. But with all these different ways of oppressing civil society, like you mentioned, with surveillance laws and the NSO groups, Pegasus software, the spyware, and stuff like that, what can individuals do on the ground? What can human rights activists on the ground do against these repressive laws or things that have been institutionalized within Bahrain? How can they overcome that going forward?
Well, I would say that in case of Bahrain, that's also what we see. That many of the most well-known human rights defenders in the world today are Bahraini activists, and they are getting it. They are getting attention. They are well known in both in international media and at the UN, and are getting attention. And by the work they do, be it be it from Bahrain, be it in exile, or be it through being in prison, they continue to shed light on what's going on in Bahrain, and I think I'm extremely humble about the effort they are making, and I think it's important to underline that is important. It does work. It does keep Bahrain in the attention not only of us in the human rights community, but also in the broader community of civil society globally.
I know that the RAFTO Foundation was instrumental in some getting some of that international attention, especially when our former president Nabil was imprisoned for his tweeting, his Twitter activity, and there were you yourself and RAFTO were big supporters of Nabil during that time. Before I want to let Tor jump in here as well, but before we move on to Tor, what do you think is the biggest challenge for civil society going forward? You talked a little bit about the success of civil society in garnering some of that international attention. But what do you think is the biggest challenge going forward into 2022, 2023?
I think, well, there are numerous challenges, but I think one thing we see in Bahrain and what we see other places is that these authoritarian governments are trying to make it difficult for civil society to work together globally, that they are trying to take away the networks that all of us need to continue this work. And I think one of the things we can do as a civil society community is to maintain, develop, making sure that human rights defenders, be them in Bahrain or in exile or in prison, are not alone, and that they are part of networks, and that we are able to build solidarity across borders, and that we are also countering this rhetoric that we see with foreign agent laws and all of this thinking that foreign, that involving yourself in human rights issues in other countries is something illegitimate. It is not. It's part of the UN, Human Rights Charter. It's part of the basis of the international rules-based order that we build the UN on. Is that we do involve ourselves. We stand up for some universal principles, and we need to maintain that.
Thank you, Jostein. That's again a wonderful transition into the next topic I want to touch on, which is international advocacy and why that might be important for the Bahraini human rights situation. I know, Tor, you focus a lot in your work on UN advocacy. Can you talk to us a little bit about if international mechanisms have been able to really make a breakthrough in Bahrain? Has it been successful in some of these Bahraini human rights reforms, or has it kind of fallen short?
Thanks so much, Anthony. Just by way of context, as we've heard today, since the start of demonstrations against the country's undemocratic rule, the monarchy has severely restricted all civil liberties through an orchestrated campaign of unlawful arrests, revocation of citizenship, enforced disappearances, prosecutions, and detention, torture. Firsthand testimonials from activists provide a really telling assessment of the conditions in Bahrain. Where, as I mentioned before, the Civicus Monitor concludes that Bahrain is one of the most restricted countries in the world for civil society. And in response to your specific question on international support and solidarity, I think Bahraini authorities are particularly intolerant of any attempts to communicate dissent internationally. They fear damage to international reputation and their standing among key allies, including the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom. The state's international connections are crucial to enabling it to repress dissent. I think something we have to keep in mind, which is really evidenced infamously in 2011 when Saudi troops intervened to crush democratic protests, causing countless deaths. And a recent report by Civicus, which examined the sustainability of protest movements globally, and particularly in Bahrain, found that after the lifting of restrictions on civil society organizations, activists believe that international pressure on the monarchy is the most important factor for keeping the pro-democracy movement alive. So it's absolutely essential, is the feeling and response from civil society on the ground. As you know, international pressure led to the BICI report after the brutal crackdown in 2011, which documented evidence of torture and human rights violations. But in our assessment, that pressure has largely dissipated, and more must be done to motivate the UN, foreign states, and international civil society groups to pressure Bahraini authorities to ease restrictions. We've heard that greater diplomatic pressure is critical for the survival of Bahraini's human rights movement and the attainment of its goals. We heard from one Bahraini protest leader who said to us, in the case of the impact of UN and diplomatic pressure, the exception proves the rule. The only protest and civil society leaders, including myself, who have been released from prison in Bahrain, are those whose cases were aggressively taken up by the UN and the international community. Just a few other reflections on what does continued solidarity and support internationally look like for the protest movement and civil society in Bahrain. In our report, about 50% of respondents said they did not believe that they received adequate solidarity and support from international civil society. So while there has been fantastic support from many of the folks who are on this call today, they felt like support and solidarity was inadequate. 56% of our respondents indicated that the global protest movements from other countries did not show adequate support and solidarity. More still, 80% believe that foreign states and multilateral bodies, including the UN and its various mechanisms, did not adequately support the movement. And finally, while 72% stated that international media outlets failed to cover the movement and the backlash against it adequately. So the inference here is that the support from all civil society quarters was deemed insufficient, but that international civil society and protest movements were considered the most supportive and more supportive than the UN and foreign states. I think these deficits matter because support and pressure from international and UN bodies and foreign states were considered to be the kind of external factors that would contribute most to the sustainability of the protest movement, far ahead of civil society. So despite the fact that international support from states and UN is the most important, many felt like it was the most lacking at the same time. So this suggests some very clear potential to enhance the sustainability of the movement that's not currently realized. And I just want to conclude by saying that international solidarity, I think, can make a huge difference. Concerned citizens from countries that prop up the Bahraini state, Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the US, could be more proactive in bringing up change by calling on their leaders to use their influence and investments for good and to insist that human rights are upheld, protest is permitted, and any abuse against citizens are investigated. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing those statistics. They're quite striking. Especially that part about how respondents feel that UN or international support is the most important but the most lacking. This is something that I think Seema and Joe both talked about in their remarks, especially with regards to the US and the UK, in supporting and upholding some of these norms and practices in Bahrain. And anybody can feel free to jump in here, but what are the biggest obstacles to garnering that international support? And why has the US and the UK been lacking in promoting or enforcing some of these respects for human rights?
I'll hand over to Seema, but I just want to say very quickly that I think until the US and the UK stop privileging their economic priorities, whether arms trade or oil or otherwise, over human rights, it will be very difficult to see movement on these issues. And I think the current global climate of civic space is indicative of these countries' unwillingness to sublimate economic interests to human rights. And until the US, the UK, and other governments get serious about investing in democracy and human rights globally, that the authoritarian trend will continue to ascend, and it will be exceedingly difficult to provide civil society with the resources and support they need to overcome the very severe challenges they face from within their own borders, supported by a number of autocratic governments from without. But I think Seema might have much more to say about this.
Thank you. I don't think, you took the words out of my mouth. Very clearly, be it the US or the UK have too much invested, in the Gulf countries and Bahrain in particular in this case. Be it, through sports washing and all that, that they are accepting the norms and what they are fed by the Bahraini authorities, who have an excellent system of PR, of translating whatever they are doing in such a way that, oh no, it's perfect. It's far from it. And the US, the UK, and other allies are just accepting this this discourse and not wanting, because it would create too much issues internally for them economically. They're not willing to accept that there is another narrative here. And if they hear it, they only hear it a little bit and they brush it under the carpet. It's not important enough in the balance for them to act differently. And I think, what could we do better? Certainly, we need to do better. However, it is 11 years on and we have the same narrative, the same, we're still asking for the same things. Accountability, what happened to accountability? Definitely in the wake of the BICI report and the fact that the recommendations were accepted. There were some investigations that were so, they pushed on the carpet everything. They were not serious. They were not transparent. They were not genuine. So, that was a huge factor, definitely, with regards to the opposition leaders whom we've been talking about before. And their punishment continues. Today, we issued an urgent action on behalf of Abdul Singas to reinforce the fact that he has been on hunger strike since the 8th of July, that his situation is deteriorating, that the authorities had been refusing to pass him his writings or his research that they deemed to be apolitical, so not a danger for them, but they're still dragging their feet and giving it back to his family, something that could possibly make him think twice about continuing his hunger strike. They have stopped his family calls, video calls. Why? If that's not harassment, if that's not trying to push him on the brink, that's not going to make, I mean, he's too far gone in his hunger strike to want to stop it. So if the authorities are really genuinely trying to fix things or to be the, like what, we are reasonable, they are not. Actually, they're doing exactly the opposite. So yes, torture is not visible. I mean, they knew where to kick so it doesn't show, but it's even more subtle because it is within these dragging their feet for basic rights, for basic things where they are hurting them. These people are in prison. Abdul Singas is in prison for serving a life imprisonment sentence. I mean, what danger does he represent now? And you, as a Bahraini government who says it is open and everyone has his space and the possibility to speak out and, to participate in political life, well, you're demonstrating the opposite. So I don't know. I mean, maybe also there is, for the campaigners or people who pick up cases, the problem we have is the general fatigue. How do you get people outside Bahrain to support the cases, to carry the voices from Bahrain? The civil society of Bahrain, the diaspora is doing a fantastic job, and they do it better than we do because they also have all the know-how. They've acquired an amazing know-how that neither the civil society that has been completely quashed in the UAE is able to do, nor the one that existed at the time in Kuwait that was also silenced. I think we need to think really deeply as to how better to carry their voices and to make a change, because so far we haven't succeeded, or we've succeeded on really very limited levels. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I really want to spend some time talking about alternative sentencing and a lot of the human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience who are still in prison today in Bahrain, especially those that have been imprisoned on life sentences since 2011. And so, Seema, I wanted to ask you, what is the significance of alternative sentencing, and where does it stand right now?
Well, the authorities over the past 2 years have been touting this new law that they passed in 2017, making a big noise out of it. Yes, it has benefited, some prisoners, but it hasn't benefited those who have been campaigning for, those who are the voice of opposition, the dissenters. It hasn't. And those who have been released, and I believe they are Muhammad Jawad and recently Khalil Halwachi. The condition attached to being released under the alternative measures are huge. You have travel bans for amounts of, huge amounts of time, up to life. In the case of another case we've studied, they cannot participate in gatherings, and if these gatherings are political, it's a big no because they could go back into prison. So okay, it is an alternative measure where it is conditional, but is there a need for these conditions to be so harsh? There's no need for that. There's no need for that, especially if the society that the Bahrainis are describing, the government is describing, is such a free space, and it's not. So, there's not much more to add to this. I mean, we've seen the case of Kamil Juma, the son of Najah Yusuf, who was released under the alternative sentences. he had a whole load of cases against him that were fabricated, that they added, etc. I mean, he's banned from travel for life. I mean, that's a kid who has been harassed and targeted because of his mother's activities. What would the conditions be for the prisoners of conscience we've been working on? The opposition leaders, who are currently serving jail time. I don't know. I mean, it is cosmetic yet again. It is cosmetic in their case. Others, I mean, yes, they have released scores of offenders, like any other country would release some offenders under, conditional laws or conditions, but it's not enough. It is not enough. The proof of the pudding, the proof of anything that Bahrain is saying would have to come with the release of the opposition leaders, allow them a platform to speak out and to practice their rights to be also in an opposition politically.
I really appreciate you sharing some of these personal anecdotes and stories about the people who have been affected by this. Because these stories are really moving, and it reminds civil society why civil society needs to persist and maintain hope and keep on with the fight for human rights in Bahrain. I want to ask one more question to you, and it's, can we expect any reform with alternative sentencing? Will there be less harsh conditions? Is there a movement for less harsh conditions with alternative sentencing going forward? And if not, what can we do about it, both in the international spirit, but also what can civil society members do about it?
I think I'm not sure what's going to happen within Bahrain with regards to the political leaders in prison. We cannot say no. It's not a good law to have alternative sentencing because it has benefited lots of people, and those who took advantage of it, such as Mohammed Jawad. It is good. They are free. They are not in a confined space. They are not in a cell. Yes. And my understanding is that there is some of them to be considered have to apply for it. Now, what we know is that some of the political leaders or the opposition leaders have refused the conditions because they are so harsh. And, we will still have to call for their unconditional release because they have been detained for their freedom of expression and assembly. And that's the call that we have to continue to make. If the alternative sentencing is something that's offered to them and they choose to take it, who are we to say anything, But the conditions that are automatically attached to that should be much, much lesser and a lot lighter for them, for this freedom that they have to matter or to be really, to have any weight.
Thank you, Seema. And I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're almost out of time here. I think Joe wanted to say something. I want to give everyone the opportunity to make a closing remark in a minute or so. What is the main takeaway you want audience members to have from this anniversary event? If Joe or someone else wants to start us off, that'd be wonderful.
Oh, I think you misread my body language. Anyway, well, just look, I think the alternative sentencing, frankly, yes, the conditions that are attached to it are onerous. They're repressive. They're illegal under international rights law, for sure. But for the individuals who decide, who have access to it and who decide to take advantage of it, it's, we shouldn't demean it in any way whatsoever. And we should be calling on continue to press the authorities for unconditional release. Absolutely. We should, the decision of, and we want the authorities to be offering things like inadequate as they are. We want them to offer alternative sentencing, across the board. I mean, we should recognize too, alternative sentencing is not just for political prisoners. Okay, other prisoners can take advantage of it too. I think my impression is it's been used a lot with relatively a lot with minors or very young people who've gotten caught up in demonstrations and so forth. So yeah, we continue to highlight the onerous conditions attached to them, but frankly, it's a positive. However inadequate, it's positive, and we want to encourage those kind of incremental movements that are not far from enough